And the current Ukrainian version of that is that we were completely betrayed, traduced by the West. They persuaded us to fight on. They didn't give us the arms. It's going to be an absolutely massive blame game, and the West is going to be absolutely vilified on all sides.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. Now, yesterday on our Americano show, I had what I thought was a very interesting conversation with John Mearsheimer. Not all viewers agreed, but some did, that it was very interesting, about Trump's foreign policy. And we talked about the Middle East, but we also talked about Ukraine and Russia. But unfortunately, Donald Trump being Donald Trump, he rather blew things up last night by announcing that he had had a very successful phone call with Vladimir Putin, and that peace is now on the cards. To discuss this development, I am joined by our very own Svitlana Morenets and our Russia correspondent, Owen Matthews. Svitlana, what did you make of last night's announcement from Donald Trump?
Firstly, I would say that we didn't hear much new things from Trump because even the Biden administration was saying the same things, that it's highly unlikely that Ukraine will become a NATO member in the close future, or that Ukraine can return all of its occupied territories in a military way. So all those things were already on the table, just Biden was not saying it as openly as Trump did yesterday. What was quite disappointing for Ukraine and Ukrainian government, that he said those points yesterday before actual talks with Russia. So he gave up the negotiation points before starting talks with Russia. So it means that now Ukraine is left with less leverage. Because at the beginning, Putin said that he invaded because he wouldn't like Ukraine to be a NATO member. And now he is not going to be worried about that because Trump already stated that it is off the table. He is not going to be worried about American troops being on the ground in Ukraine because Trump already said it's not going to happen. So it opens for Putin the possibility to push forward even more concessions from Ukraine, because all those other concerns that were worrying him are off the table right now.
And what did you make of it in context of what had gone on the week before? Because we knew that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has been in Kiev, and it looked as though there seemed to be sort of very Trump-like agreement with Ukraine in the offing that was going to be more about whether America gets sort of control of Ukrainian minerals in return for support. And then very Trump-like, I would say, that he then unravels that all in one Truth Social post.
Trump didn't say that he is going to stop the aid to Ukraine. It was crucial because he is waiting for that deal to happen, and Zelenskyy is reviewing it at the moment. So he expects that America will continue supplying weapons to Ukraine in exchange for access to Ukraine minerals and other resources that we have in our country. I don't know if that Zelenskyy will sign the deal, considering that Trump didn't offer any security guarantees for Ukraine, and it is very unclear if that weapon supply will actually happen, because right now it's only on talks and not on the paper. And actually, after Trump's speech yesterday, many Ukrainians were calling on Zelenskyy not to sign the deal until we receive still security guarantees from US that Russia won't invade again if the peace deal is signed.
Owen, what do you think is going on here? What's Trump's game? How do we square what was going on with Scott Bessent with what he's talking about last night? How should we read the situation?
I think the time has come to stop lying to Ukraine and stop lying to ourselves. And Svitlana is right that the US administration was a little bit more skeptical towards the end about its initial promises to support Ukraine until victory and give Ukraine whatever it takes. But the real dissonance was between Trump's very pragmatic and frankly brutal, and to many Ukrainians very insulting position of sort of frank truth telling. The difference between what Trump is saying, what the Europeans are saying, and what the British are saying. I mean, the British Secretary of Defense is still absolutely singing from that old hymn book that we should, support Ukraine and that Ukraine will fight on. But where Trump is cutting through is he's saying the things that he's saying, the quiet part out loud, things that everyone has pretty much known to be true. And in sort of off-the-record conversations with many of Zelensky's closest advisors and colleagues in the presidential administration, I mean, I haven't met anybody, not even the most senior Zelensky advisors, who actually ever believed that they were really going to get Crimea back. And in fact, there was deep skepticism about getting Donbass back. And furthermore, I mean, it's always been clear right from the beginning, I mean, that there is no technical, political, or legal way for Ukraine to become a full member of NATO. It was always totally chimerical, and it was sort of absurd that we were even discussing it, that it is a real possibility, given the catastrophic consequences of that discussion in terms of Russia's reaction. So, although Trump's cynicism is pretty offensive, in saying he wants to get back his return on investment and get Ukraine minerals. I mean, that's not exactly Churchillian or Rooseveltian. That's pretty sordid. Despite the fact that he's blunt, offensive, and transactional, my point in my latest piece is actually I think Trump has the best opportunity yet to actually bring this conflict to an end, and by discarding the pieties that would otherwise have been discussed. I mean, what Svitlana calls like negotiating points, but I mean they're not negotiating points that really could ever be exchanged for anything, because there was no meaningful way in which there really could have been a path to full NATO membership, for instance, or for recovery of territories. That's not on the table, so it would have been a waste of time to discuss it anyway. So in that sense, we're just really down to brass tacks, like the very fundamentals of what's actually going to happen otherwise, as opposed to what we in the West might want to happen.
Well, I will let Svetlana respond to that. I mean, you mentioned there a guarantee that Russia won't invade again. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's off the cards, is it?
Of course, because one of the main problems right now is that Trump's team said that those peacekeeping troops, European troops, for example, British troops that will monitor the front line after the peace deal is signed, they won't be safeguarded by the NATO Article 5. So it has to be some kind of different guarantee and procedure what they're going to do if Russia attacks again. And that's the main point, because for Ukraine, right now Ukraine is fighting for its independence and sovereignty as a country, even if part of our territory is still occupied. And the most important thing is to ensure that this war doesn't start again, because after all these statements that are coming from Trump administration, Ukrainians are already talking that we should prepare for another war, and it's horrible. And imagine that we end up in a deal when Ukraine doesn't get any security guarantees. And for example, we have not been offered any yet, except for European troops on the ground in Ukraine. But again, there is nobody saying what they're going to do if Russia invades again, if Russia attacks again. And imagine that we sign a deal without those security guarantees, and then Ukraine lifts the martial law in Ukraine, and then we open the border, and a lot of people are going to flee, especially people who have children whose sons are 17 years old and they're close to the conscription age. They will want to save their children from the possible war. We already had it happen in 2014, 2015, when a lot of people fled. And is Europe ready to accept many more millions of Ukrainian refugees again? If they think that the war is going to happen again, they're going to leave Ukraine.
From Zelensky's point of view, then, as you understand it, what is an acceptable security guarantee?
What he said recently, if Ukraine is not a NATO member, then the security guarantee will be to provide Ukraine long-range weapons, long-range missiles, and to finance Ukrainian army, because Ukraine will need to have a strong army as Russia has, and somebody has to pay money for that. The same goes for the peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. Somebody has to sponsor their stations there every day. Who is going to do it? Trump's team says that it's up to Europe to finance that and to secure the peace in Ukraine after the war ends. Is Europe ready for those expenses? We don't know yet.
Oh, and it sounds to me like your problem is just with the way Trump says things, not with what he's actually saying. Am I being cynical about you?
I'm in strong agreement with Svitlana that the absolute bottom line and the key point that the Ukraine and that the West have to come away with and focus on is a security guarantee that stops this happening again. That's totally true. And it's also true, as Svitlana pointed out, that Trump has not touched that yet. If you think that the main wellspring of Putin's motivation was not actually imperialist fantasy, but what he considers to be Russia's vital national interests, and he's willing to sacrifice everything from hundreds of thousands of troops to his entire economy just to make sure that Ukraine specifically does not join NATO. He doesn't mind other countries joining NATO. He's fine with Finland and Sweden joining NATO. It's not NATO expansion. It's Ukraine being in NATO that really bothers him. Then signing up Ukraine for NATO is the one thing that is guaranteed to keep this war going. And exactly the same logic applies to peacekeepers. That actually the one thing that will absolutely guarantee that that Putin will test the Western will is to have Western groups on the boots on the ground. So I personally am of the opinion that in fact Ukraine is in fact going to end up being the best guarantor of its own security, and that's essentially what Zelenskyy said today. That was his response: "Is the Zelenskyy we had to make our own NATO," and that's not really as crazy as it sounds, because the Ukrainian army is by far the most powerful and populous and technically sophisticated and operationally sophisticated and experienced army on the European continent. The British Army has got 55,000 deployable troops. That's fewer people than Ukraine has lost in this entire war, dead. Probably far less. I mean, Ukraine's military has done an extraordinary job, and this is what we tend to ignore or forget when we talk about Putin's victory. Putin didn't go to war with NATO. He's not at war with Britain or America. He's at war with Ukraine, and it was Ukraine's army that fought this powerful country, 4 times its population, 20 times its economy, with nuclear weapons. It was the Ukrainians that fought them to a standstill. Okay, they had Western weapons. The Soviet Union had American weapons in World War II. It doesn't detract from the fact that actually the people that were fighting and dying. So actually, Ukraine itself has turned out to be an incredibly tough nut, and that the Russian army was fought to a standstill by them, and actually making sure that Ukraine has a functional and effective military, or maintaining the functionality and effectiveness of its military, I think is ultimately going to be the best security guarantee. In practical terms. And then, of course, you have diplomatic guarantees. And those have kind of a bad reputation because everyone's going to say, oh, it's like a second rerun of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 that supposedly guaranteed Ukraine's security in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons, and was basically not honored in 2014. That's exactly what it's going to be. It's going to be like a retread of the Budapest Memorandum, but this time actually with, we hope, more binding force.
But Svetlana, I mean, is that a key point here? That what are Putin's actual intentions? Do you think, from the West point of view, not from Ukraine's, do you think that his intention is to keep invading parts of Eastern Europe until he can't be stopped, or until he isn't stopped anymore, until he takes over the world? I mean, do we have to be realistic about what we think Putin's intentions are?
His first intention is to take over Ukraine completely, and in a lot of essays that he have written and what his aides are saying is that he wants to restore the Russian Empire. How seriously we should take that? I mean, Putin started the war in Georgia, also in Ukraine. Belarus is already under his complete control. He installed pro-Russian government in Georgia and is trying to do so in Moldova and Romania. So I think that Putin tries to reshape the sphere of influence of the America, of the Russia and China, and he thinks that Russia is one of the main players and they have to be ruling over this region. And I also think that one of his terms will be that NATO withdraws its troops from Eastern Europe, and it's quite very dangerous if to think about that. And also the Baltic states and Poland are so eager in supporting Ukraine because they are completely sure that they will be the next invaded. And right now we have a problem that they are not sure that NATO's Article 5 will actually work, considering that Trump is saying America first, and will actually they come to help if they are attacked. And one of the main Putin's goals was to break NATO apart and to bring the doubt to NATO allies that will they be protected in case of the war. And as for Ukraine, I would want to repeat Zelensky's point when he said first in 2022, when Russia invaded, Zelensky was ready for Ukraine to be neutral and said we are not going to be NATO members. But the invasion continued anyway. And recently he said, okay, we are not NATO members. If it was the goal of Russia that we will never join NATO, then Putin should withdraw from all the occupied Ukrainian lands. But instead, Russia's term right now is to keep the 4 regions it occupies. And also part of the lands that Ukraine still controls, and Ukraine obviously can never agree to that. And in those regions Russia holds, you can see that they erase Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, they can torture people if they see Ukrainian flag on the street. So one of the reasons also was a demographic situation in Russia, and right before the invasion, Putin said we have to manage that problem very fast before 2030. We don't have enough people in our country, and the fastest way to do it, as we see, was to invade Ukraine. And at the beginning, Putin's goal was to take over Kyiv and install the pro-Russian government there. For example, Viktor Medvedchuk, who was later exchanged to Russia. And that's why Russia right now is talking that Zelenskyy is not a legitimate president. And it was quite worrying to hear that yesterday from Trump. He didn't say that specifically, but he said also about the need for elections in Ukraine. And I'm afraid that they will keep pushing this forward before the actual peace deal. And Putin recently said that Zelenskyy can't sign any peace document because he is not a legitimate president, because his term ran out last May. And nobody is talking that Putin is in power for 30 years already, but the problem is Zelenskyy, because we couldn't have the elections because of the war. And if we have the elections right now, first, it's very difficult to make them because how soldiers are going to vote, will they have to leave the front line, people who are abroad? And also it would just tear the country apart, and I would say it's exactly what Putin wants.
Well, I mean, aside from the logistical difficulties of having an election during a war, I mean, why would it tear the country apart? Because a lot of people are unhappy with Zelenskyy? I mean, why? I didn't quite.
What is the benefit of having political rivalries in the times of the war? I mean, the only reason why Ukraine could stand against Russia was because at the beginning all the parties united, all the opposition united, and they said, okay, we are not going to talk about politics, we will do everything for Ukraine to survive. And actually last year all the opposition agreed that the elections are going to be held 6 months after the peace deal is signed. So it is agreed by everyone in the parliament, and the most of the Ukrainian population is against elections before the peace deal is made. So why to pressure Ukraine trying to do that? And also taking into account that Russian missiles can target any of the polling stations. How can you ensure that people will be safe, and that also international observers will come to Ukraine while the country is still at war, and they will try to monitor that elections are fair? How people in occupied lands are going to vote? Are they going to vote at all? If they don't vote, does it mean that they belong to Russia right now because they don't have the right to choose the Ukrainian president? So there are a lot of these things that Ukraine has to manage, and also we need to check how actually many people we have in Ukraine, because we have internally displaced people, and there are over 6 million inside of the country. How are they going to vote? So it's a long process, it's an expensive process, and also about the soldiers, they will have to leave the front line to vote. That's why only after the peace deal is made, the election is possible in Ukraine.
Owen, what do you think about Zelenskyy's position? In particular, because he and Trump have this interesting relationship going back to Trump's first term. His first impeachment, of course, was over Ukraine. Trump seems to regard him with more suspicion than most Western leaders. I think that's fair to say. And it looks like Trump is accepting this argument that if Ukraine is going to be a democracy, and we're talking about protecting democracies, then Ukraine needs to have elections. But Svitlana's made the case against that.
I don't think anyone in Ukraine disagrees that there should be elections. The only question is when they should be. Then they will tear Ukraine apart for two very good reasons. One, there is next to no chance that Zelensky will be re-elected. Currently, only 16% of the electorate would vote for him. The other reason that it will tear the country apart is that a large number of Zelensky's closest advisors will be in prison, or for the gigantic amount of money that they and their cronies have stolen, and that's also phenomenally corrosive of Ukrainian morale, because over 75% of Ukrainians believe that there's been a lot of profiteering over this war by government-adjacent oligarchs and cronies, and I fear that they're right. And the third reason is that the main issue of the Ukrainian elections is going to be a massive blame game. And there's going to be an absolutely sort of massive, what the Germans call it, Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back legend, that followed the German defeat in the First World War. And that goes that the German army was winning in the field and was stabbed in the back by cowardly civilians. And the current Ukrainian version of that is that we were completely betrayed, traduced by the West. They persuaded us to fight on. They didn't give us the arms. It's going to be an absolutely massive blame game, and the West is going to be absolutely vilified on all sides. In that sense, Zelensky's position, Trump's position, is very useful to Zelensky, to be honest, because making any kind of concessions is completely politically toxic. It's political death for any Ukrainian leader, not just Zelensky, but anybody, to make any kind of concessions, and especially to see the de facto partition of their country. The only way that actually in practical terms can be done is not with Ukrainian consent, because it's unachievable. It's only when someone comes in from outside and imposes that deal and leaves Zelensky no choice. He just has to say, like, I'm sorry, guys, we can't do this anymore because the Americans up there told us that no more arms, we can't do it. We have to, because we were forced into this humiliation. And politically, that is something that Zelensky can do. He can say, I did my best, and we were betrayed, stabbed in the back. But actually, in practical terms, Trump is delivering something that is pretty much inevitable, and it's been devastatingly obvious for some time the way this war will end, which is with de facto, not de jure, not legally, but de facto partition of Ukraine along the line of control. And we don't know where that will be by the time the peace settlement comes, but the Russian steamroller grinds on. And the other element is going to be security guarantees for Ukraine short of NATO membership. That's what's going to happen. But it's not something that actually can be achieved inside Ukraine, because it's something that will be seen as a terrible defeat and humiliation. And therefore, America is a necessary part of the equation. It's absolutely essential for America to do that, and basically to close that deal, because it's not something that the Ukrainians can sort of politically or patriotically do for themselves.
Owen says that a majority of Ukrainians are against Zelensky now probably because they think he's corrupt, and they know about a lot of corruptions, or they think they know about a lot of corruption under his government. Do you think Zelensky is corrupt?
What Ukrainians are blaming Zelensky for is that he didn't prepare enough for the invasion. And recently we had, just last week, a Ukrainian former commander who was interviewed by one of Ukrainian media, and he said that until the last moment, Zelensky team was not saying to Ukrainian command that Russia was actually going to invade, and that they could mobilize all the troops only after Zelensky's order, and Zelensky delayed that order for too late. And also there is some blame, for example, that some of the bridges in the Kherson region were not blown up, so Russian troops could actually invade the region from Crimea, and they also blame Zelensky for this. But at the same time, I would say that it plays Zelenskyy in hand that there was no political rivalry in these 3 years. And I would say that many people are convinced that he actually can be re-elected for the second term if Valery Zaluzhny, the current Ukrainian ambassador to Britain, if he doesn't participate in the election, that Zelenskyy will be the one to win. Because according to all the polls, even if Zelenskyy has like 16-20% of support, all the other possible presidents, possible candidates into presidents, they have much less. And it is one of the arguments why Ukrainians say maybe there is not a point making elections now because Zelenskyy is going to be just re-elected, and what was all the point about having them right now?
I'm a bit suspicious of this argument that Zelenskyy isn't corrupt, it's just the people around him. I think that's not a very good defense of a leader. I mean, surely you need to be in control of your administration. But aside from that point, is there a political advantage is it in Zelensky's interest now to not win an election? If there's a negotiated peace, does he want to be the leader? Who wants to be the leader of Ukraine after this war? Because it's going to be very, very difficult.
We don't know yet if Zelenskyy is going to apply for the second term, because he is very ambiguous and he says, like, we will see how the peace deal goes. I would say for him the right step would be to step down and just be remembered in Ukraine as a world leader who helped to preserve the country in the most crucial time, and to give a fresh breath to the Ukrainian politics. And so the new team comes and I help to solve Ukrainian problems, about to rebuild the country, about rebuilding our army, making all the reforms. But from what I hear, he's gonna try for the second term. So I don't know. I think he has very high chances to win, especially if there will be only 6 months for the elections and all the other new candidates to emerge. They won't have time to gain that popularity that Zelenskyy still has. Of course, it has fallen significantly, but he's still very popular in Ukraine.
I wonder also, I'll ask you both about this. Owen raised this point about this feeling among Ukrainians of Western betrayal.
Yeah, of course.
This is we already hear a bit of this now. It seems to me fair from a media point of view, because a lot of Western politicians said very firm things that will stay with Ukraine all the way. There were promises of NATO commitments from some people. But the West was never going to contribute troops to the Ukrainian effort. I think that was understood. And so what do Ukrainians fairly expect from the West?
Look, at the beginning, Ukraine really had a chance to throw out Russian troops, not from all of Ukraine, but most of the regions, when in 2022, Ukraine had a successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv region, and they kicked off Russians. And they kicked off Russians from Kherson. It is already reported that Biden and his administration said them to stop because they were fearing the nuclear war with Russia. And Ukrainians feel very angry about that, because we actually had a chance to continue the successful counteroffensive, but we were stopped, and Russia was allowed to regroup and then to continue their offensive in the next year. And also about the weapons, in 2023, when Ukraine went into another counteroffensive that everybody was expecting to be successful, but we had like 12 tanks. I mean, it was just wasting Ukrainian lives for nothing. And if you are at the beginning, our allies said that they will be with Ukraine until victory. At the beginning, they were saying that. Then they said, we're going to be with Ukraine as long as it takes. It was outrageous. What does it mean, as long as it takes? As long as the last Ukrainian dies, or how should we take that? And that was the...
Now you're sounding like a Russian, because you're saying the West was always going to fight till the last Ukrainian.
No, it's not what I mean.
Yeah.
It's what I mean is that they were not given us enough means to continue the fight, to actually have some gains and to win. They're just giving us enough not to lose the war completely. So the war was just going to drag on indefinitely. And what Ukrainians hoped is that when Trump comes, there will be more decisive things from him, not just like as long as it takes, but he actually stands with Ukraine, or we're talking about peace agreement, not just the war prolongs for years or decades. And unfortunately, there is a big disappointment about Trump right now, considering his statements, because Ukraine hoped actually he would stand on Ukraine's side. But now we see that his priority is to stop the killings as soon as possible. And I have nothing against stopping the killings. Ukrainians are the first who want this war to end. The problem is on what terms it will be.
Oh, and Donald Trump, of course, says that the war never would have happened under his watch. But what Svetlana's talking about there is a fair point, which is that Ukrainians were probably right to feel betrayed by the West, because we do seem to have promised them victory. We promised them that we'd be on their side until the bitter end, and we were never really going to do that.
It's certainly true that we didn't give them as much as they wanted and needed. That's certainly true, but it does kind of beg the question, how much hypothetically in a conventional war situation would Ukraine have required in terms of men and material compared to the massive orders of magnitude size disparity between them and the Russian army. So I think the problem with it with that argument, we were betrayed, is that it sort of strays dangerously close to kind of like sort of conceding the main Putin attack line, which is that the Ukrainians are just puppets and have no agency, and we were put up to it. They made us fight, and they didn't give us enough material, and we lost, and it's their fault. It's actually sort of strangely, in my opinion, kind of a denial of Ukraine's agency. Ukraine was attacked. Ukraine was fighting for its life. It was pleaded very effectively for as much material support as it could get. And then, as I've mentioned earlier in my earlier response, it did a fantastic and entirely unexpected by anybody, unexpectedly brilliant job of actually resisting the Russians right at the beginning. Through some very quick sort of tactical actions around Kiev in the first days of the war, and then later, the problem is that we're going to be hearing a lot more of these stories like, oh, we could have advanced, then, like, we took Kherson, but then we was prevented from crossing the river. Like Svitlana just said that. Well, okay. There are a million sort of conspiracy theories of that nature that, like, America stopped us from winning. And those are the kind of things that defeated peoples tell themselves in order to feel less bad about their defeat. But actually, the Ukrainians, although they've lost territory, have actually fought the Russians to a standstill. That's not a defeat. Russia has beggared his own country. Putin has beggared his own country. He's turned it into a vassal of China. His only allies in the world are ridiculous rogue pariah states. He's completely blown his Gazprom's chokehold over Europe's strategic energy reserves. He's killed at least 200,000 of his own men. He's spending 40% of his. He's lost 1 million of his brightest and best people who have fled his regime. His war effort has been completely disastrous. The only thing that he's actually gained is not control over Ukraine. It's not control over any kind of post-Soviet space. In fact, what he's done is he's got 22% of an absolutely devastated, war-torn country, Ukraine, and increased the surface area of the Russian Federation by 0.4%. It's like tiny. So it's a catastrophe and for Putin. And I think that a lot of the discourse over the next days and weeks and months, by the way, this isn't going to happen very quickly. I think Putin's going to sort of play hard to get and draw out the negotiations. But I think that it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that this is not a defeat for Ukraine. And it's rather surprising to hear that the Ukrainians themselves discussing it in those terms, because they're actually doing themselves a disservice. They've actually done a magnificent thing, just as the Finns did in 1939 to 40. And they've actually saved their country and pushed back against it. It's a real David and Goliath story.
Svetlana, would you like to come back on that? We've got a response to what Owen's saying there.
I would add about Ukrainian occupied territories, because what I hear all the analytics talking about it just as a piece of land, then let just Russia keep it, and why Ukraine was so eager to actually deoccupy them, because we have thousands of Ukrainians still living there under Russian regime with no freedom, with no rights, forced to learn Russian language and with history rewritten, with them being imprisoned, with journalists that are keeping being imprisoned in Crimea, for example, constantly, for example, like Crimean Tatars, there are constant repressions in those lands, and nobody in the West seems to care about the fate of those people, what actually happens to them, and nobody also talks right now about what reparations Ukraine is going to receive for all the suffering it has suffered. Zelenskyy offered Trump that he seizes 300,000 billion of Russian frozen assets, and what I saw today from reporting that Trump refused it. So who is going to pay for reparation? Is it going to be Europe? How is it going to work? Because for now, the deal, what it seems to emerge, is that Putin keeps those occupied territories. Of course, they are not going to be internationally recognized as Russian, but he is going to keep his control over them. But he will be rewarded of his aggression, but he is not going to pay for all those crimes that he and his army committed in Ukraine. And how is it a just peace?
Well, I think one thing we can say for sure is it's not going to be resolved in 24 hours, and it was never going to be. But Svitlana, thank you very much for joining us. And Owen, thank you to you too.